In a world teeming with chaos and uncertainty, it seems that now more than ever, evil is conspiring to conceal the truth, the existence of the supernatural, UFOs, cryptids, and the unseen realm. In today's episode, I present to you all a compilation of UFO sightings, curses, elusive creatures, and conspiracies designed to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. So prepare yourselves, my friends, as we dive in deep. Our first stop, the Appalachians. Brad Lane was a brave hiker, and during the summer of 2011, his hike along the Appalachian Trail was going as planned until he began noticing something strange whenever he stopped for the night. The sound of someone mumbling, or in his words, grumbling, would often well up from outside his tent somewhere deep in the forest. With this came the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls tramping across dried leaves and sticks. Now at first, Brad was convinced that he was just spooking himself. You know, the outdoors paranoia. It's easy to let your imagination run wild when you hear the sounds of animals or the wind in the forest at night. But for Brad, seeing was believing. He later shared on the website Blue Ridge Outdoors what he saw roughly about 15 miles outside of Newcastle, Virginia. I managed to collect a fair amount of firewood, and by the time nightfall came, I had a small fire going with a good collection of firewood piled beneath me. Under the reassuring light of the campfire, I started to become more at ease with the deafening silence of nature. I pulled a cigarette from my pocket and enjoyed a casual smoke as I put my feet up. When I tried to ditch the butt in my weakening flame, my throw was off and it landed outside of the ashes. I got up to fix my mistake and to stoke the fire. When I turned around to go back to my seat, I saw him. The light was low with my little fire, but I could clearly see a man reaching down with a scorched hand for my firewood. He wore red plaid with large black burns tearing at its trim and a red ashy beard that smoldered his face. He quickly looked up and his vacant white eyes connected with mine. He gritted his teeth and scrunched his nose towards me before quickly leaving the ring of firelight. I was shocked. I have never experienced fear like it. I fell right onto my butt next to the flames. I looked out into the forest and saw nothing but dark shadows and unclear objects. A blank wall of nothing, of everything. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even yell, with no one to hear me but him. So I did what every red-blooded American would do. I packed up my things and got the hell out of Dodge. This was frightening enough, but Brad's terrifying trip did not end there. He pushed forward until dawn, never daring to use his headlamp lest the ghostly apparition follow him. At last, he stopped to rest, pitched his tent, and ate a bit of food, and he was so exhausted that he didn't even make it into his shelter. He just passed out there on the grass. Now, when he awoke, the first thing he noticed was an awful odor. He said that the first thing it brought to mind was the horrific, gut-wrenching stench of a dead animal. Things only got worse when he opened his eyes and saw that the source of the smell was his tent, or rather, what remained of it. The melted green plastic lay pooled around the poles, sending a plume of oily gray smoke into the air, and somehow the tent had combusted in 3 hours he had dozed off. Now, Brad claims that he once more fled the scene, running as quickly as he could through an empty pasture. Now, luckily, his trajectory intersected with a gravel road. Now, he followed this until, at last, he spotted a police car parked some ways in the distance. He tumbled toward it, head over heels, and what happened next chilled him to the bone. Brad had this to say: "When I got closer to the vehicle, I noticed that it was parked outside of the remains of a charred house. Nothing left standing but the mailbox out front. On the way into town, I didn't tell the officer about my experience, being afraid that he might think I escaped from the loony bin, and instead asked him about the burnt down house he had parked in front of. The sheriff explained to me that 4 days days prior, the same day I started my trip, the house had burned down. They had no known cause, but there was indication of arson. 2 daughters, a wife, and her husband were all in the house when the fire started, and none of them made it out. Real tragic stuff, the sheriff said as he retold the story, and I could only shake my head with my bottom jaw hanging low. Did Bradley encounter the wandering spirit of the father seeking rest in the aftermath of this horrific tragedy? Or is he just pulling our leg with the entire story? Yet another hiker on the Appalachian Trail reported their own ghostly apparition far to the north near Pierce Pond in Maine. The hiker, whom we will call Ryan, said that he was relaxing by the fireside one evening when he got the fright of his life. It was June, and the evening was refreshingly comfortable, with a notable absence of insects. Now, after eating and innocently playing his harmonica a bit, he decided to do some journaling while the fire died out. Now, across the fading embers, something uncanny stepped from the darkness, and Ryan said this: "Through the moonlight, I could see something that kind of took me aback, and I sat still as possible while trying to slouch into my sleeping bag. There is no doubt it was a figure that was moving across my sight between me and the pond. It was definitely the form of a spectral, woodsy outdoorsman type with a small pack and what appeared to be fishing gear. The figure faded into the night, and I woke refreshed and relieved to be on the trail in such a beautiful location. I thought about heading out as my first experience like this had me unnerved, but the day was beautiful, and I mostly forgot about it as I stayed on to enjoy another day. But as my campfire lit the trees around me that night, this same woodsy character reappeared. As the fire crackled, its eyes turned toward me, and I was truly frightened for the first time in my life. I ran up the hill away from the lean-to and didn't stop till I could barely breathe." Ryan later learned that other hikers had noticed this same phantom fisherman stalking this portion of the trail over the years. Now, luckily, these specters seem to have no interest in causing anyone any mischief or harm. Ghosts are not the only things to worry about when traveling the Appalachian Trail, because in the mid-1980s, a father and son hiking through Amherst County, Virginia, with their family dog Ginger, decided to rest in one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. Now, as they were relaxing, a tall, dark figure came shambling out of the trees. It reached within 100 feet of the shelter and sent Ginger barking. The stranger appeared to be wearing a long, thick fur coat. At first, the witnesses did not think anything of it and shouted to the figure, thinking it would be nice to invite a fellow hiker in for a hot beverage or a slice of pizza. However, something terrifying happened. In the words of the witnesses, the dog's bark changed to something I had never heard from her before that event nor after. The figure turned to look at them, revealing a face that straddled the line between human and non-human. When its entire body turned in their direction, the witnesses said that Ginger's hind legs appeared uncontrolled. Her sounds were not barking sounds, but a gurgling noise. She was in great agony and pain. I momentarily focused on Ginger, reaching down to her, which did not stop her suffering. When they looked back up, the creature was moving again. It took several long, graceful strides and slipped back into the forest. Ginger recovered, of course, settling into an agitated but entirely normal bark. Don't get too close, because remember, Ginger snaps. Now, the son looked to his father and asked what had happened to their dog. How could that creature have affected her at 100 feet away? Now, somehow, the hikers managed to endure a cold night in the shelter, but Ginger was on high alert the entire evening. They returned to their car the following day, and both Ginger and the son slept the entire drive home. Now, in the years since their encounter, the father has learned some very unsettling details about that specific stretch of the Appalachian Trail. It seems as if dogs disappear there during the fall and winter. Those that don't are often spooked by unseen things in the woods. Locals whisper tales of something that they call the brown man. Now, worst of all, in August of 2011, a dead hiker was discovered half buried at the exact same shelter where the brown man incapacitated Ginger over 30 years ago. And at nearly 2,000 miles long, the Appalachian Mountains are one of the defining features of the North American landscape, both from an anthropological and geological perspective. They stretch from Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada, all the way down into central Alabama. Dozens of unique cultures arose in the shadows of these very peaks, from the First Nations people who dwell there to the innumerable immigrants who eventually called them home. While they may not be as tall as some mountains in places like Alaska or Colorado, this is only because they have been around much longer, in fact. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountains on Earth, supposedly. With this extreme age, one question lingers. Are there things older than humanity itself, older than time itself, that still linger in the hills and the hollers of the Appalachia? I mean, while the communities dotting the Appalachian Mountains are no stranger to the paranormal, a number of chilling accounts also come from those hiking the Appalachian Trail. And at 2,200 miles, the Appalachian Trail is the longest trail in the world solely dedicated to hiking. And when combined with the intense isolation of some of its more remote stretches, provides ample opportunities for encountering the unknown. I mean, more than 3 million people visit the Appalachian Trail each year. Of those, only a handful experience something truly out of the ordinary, and only a fraction of those are truly paranormal. An even smaller amount vanish or die, never to return. So, while your odds of being harmed are extremely low, be careful. The last thing you want to become is a member of this very elite, sometimes very dead club. Imagine this. You set out on a grand adventure into the wilderness of Nahani National Park. Everything is going good until night falls. You begin hearing strange noises and they begin to approach your tent. And the next thing you know, you're thrust out of your tent and wham! Off goes your head, decapitated. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason it is named the Headless Valley. Kind of. For instance, a girl named May Lafferty vanished in what would become one of the area's most unsettling incidents. Now, May had arrived in the Nahani Valley during the summer of 1921 with her cousin, Mary Field, and her husband, Poole Field. Everybody always regarded May as peculiar. Now, one acquaintance even described her as neurotic. But this only heightened on her trip to Nahani, where she fell deeply homesick, longing for her home of Fort Simpson. Now, on their 1921 trip, the Fields and May were accompanied by a seasoned party of indigenous guides. The plan was to exchange furs at local trading posts for a variety of goods, including ammunition and food. One day, however, May simply vanished. At first, everyone suspected that she had simply left to use the bathroom, but when she failed to return later in the day, everyone grew deeply concerned. Mary Field asked her husband to lead the effort to find the girl, and Poole Field wasted no time. He set off into the wilderness with 5 indigenous hunters, all of whom knew the area and bushcraft exceedingly well. They quickly found May's trail in the woods, and from what they could tell, the girl had simply gotten turned around and wandered off in the wrong direction. Now, Poole Field was no stranger to the outdoors, but even he found it difficult to keep up with the pace of his guides. They noticed something odd. May's footprints seemed to indicate that she had moved with a speed and dexterity rivaling their own. Somehow, this girl had moved through the forest better than the best tracker. May Lafferty also traveled incredibly far. For 9 days, Poole and the hunters tracked May's footprints, and from time to time they would discover bits of her tattered clothing draped on the branches. They found so much, in fact, that it seemed as if she had deliberately shed her clothing. Now, this was beyond comprehension for a number of reasons, not the least of which the inundation of mosquitoes that the Nahani Valley suffers in the summer months. It simply defied all logic. At last, their journey reached an end, according to the book Nahani by Dick Turner. By now, she had got into rugged country where she had to do some very steep climbing. She must have been without fear, for she climbed some cliffs where the men were afraid to go and had to go away around and pick up her track on top. The hunters came to the bottom of a very rugged high cliff, which was actually the side of a 5,000
1,000-foot mountain. Her tracks were visible at the bottom, but they could find no sign that she had turned to the left or the right. And Poole said there was just no way that any sane person could have possibly gone up that wall of the rock. There was an indication that she might have tried, for there was a narrow shelf-like ledge up for 100 feet or so. Some of them went partway up but turned back, and Poole thought for sure they had come to the end of the trail, but they worked their way round to the top, and sure enough, there was her track again, heading south and east. Sane or not, she was heading in the direction of her home, which was Simpson. The search party was called off only a few days later. May Lafferty was abandoned for dead, although to this day, her remains have never really been recovered. Now, Nahani Valley claimed another victim around the same time. In the early 1920s, fur trapper and World War I veteran John O'Brien set off into the Nahani Valley, hoping to find some peace and solitude, and perhaps wealth, in this isolated local. Along the banks of the Jackfish River, he built a simple cabin sharing a trap line with another man whose name has been lost to the mists of time. Now, at any rate, John found some degree of success until 1922. On January 27th, he departed his home to check some traps that he had set in the days prior. So John told his partner that he would be out in the wilderness for somewhere between 8 to 10 days in total. According to some versions of the tale, he did not return for 2 weeks, at which point his partner set out to search for him. Other renditions have his partner playing the part of the villain, accompanying him on the trip only to abandon him. What we do know is that John was missing for around a month before two others, Jack LaFair and Jonas Lafferty, went out to find him. Word of John's disappearance had reached their cabin at the Clawson Creek Hot Springs, and they set off on their search for the missing comrade. Jack and Jonas scoured the countryside for any sign of John. They eventually discovered his body high on the lonesome peak at the end of his trapline. He appeared frozen, though why he let his situation become so dire is anyone's guess. From what they could tell, it appeared as if John had been trying to light a fire at the time he succumbed to the frigid Canadian winter. In his hand, he held a large box of matches. Now, John O'Brien was buried where they found him. From that day forward, that site has been known as O'Brien's Mountain. One of the more famous deaths from the early 20th century contributed to the Nahani reputation as the Headless Valley. The victim, known only as Yukon Fisher, was a giant of a man with a reputation for winning every fight he participated in. After an especially violent brawl, Fisher fled to the Nahani wilderness where he lived as an outlaw. Fisher lived nomadically, leaving behind a string of crude bush shelters wherever he went. Ever the loner, his only contact with the outside world was when he dropped in on the nearest trading post to exchange bits of gold for supplies. On one occasion, an Indian tracker came to inform Fisher that he was no longer hunted by the law. The person he assaulted in the bar all those years earlier had dropped all charges. Fisher, now a fully feral wild man, refused to believe the good news and chose to remain in the wilderness. Yukon Fisher wasn't heard from again, but in 1928, an expedition in Nahani found a headless skeleton of a giant white man. Alongside his corpse were a bent carbine rifle and the remnants of a primitive shelter, similar to the kind that Yukon Fisher was famous for building. It looked as though the scene had remained the same for the past 15 years. Although it was impossible to determine the identity of the body, many believed that these were the remains of Yukon Fisher. Now, exactly how he died and where his head went and why his rifle was bent are still unknown. Tragedy and mystery continued to loom over the valley well into the 20th century, because in 1946, a Frank Henderson stumbled back to civilization after spending time in the Nahani wilderness, and he carried with him 30 ounces of gold and a horrifying tale. Now, that autumn prior, Frank and his partner, John Patterson, had planned to go out panning for gold. John was an experienced outdoorsman in relatively good health and had weathered all that life in the wilderness could throw at him. However, John never arrived at the meeting place to begin their expedition that summer. Frank was bewildered. John had left with 3 guides and 6 months' worth of provisions, but was never heard from again. When they learned of his absence, Frank's own guides abandoned him, convinced that his partner had succumbed to the diabolical forces long believed to haunt the Nahani Valley. Frank ended up spending that summer and fall panning for gold all by himself. He would never give up his search for John, even going so far as to charter an airplane to search from above, but he never found any trace of his partner. Later, he remembered that lonely season working in the valley alone, and he said, "All summer I moved with utmost caution, mostly at night. There is absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of that whole valley. The weird continual wailing of the wind is something I won't soon forget." There have been plenty of other disappearances and deaths since then. Like in 1957, 18-year-old prospector Leonard Bruchnick was discovered dead in Nahani, face down in his own vomit, the remains of a crude raft in the river nearby. Now, the cause of death remains a mystery, but the vomit may provide an important clue. Bush pilot Angus Mackenzie flew into Nahani to ferry supplies to a filming location in the fall of 1962, only to never return. 6 months later, the wreckage of this plane was discovered with 100 days worth of supplies and a diary detailing 46 days in the wilderness, but his body was never found. A year later, 3 Swiss men canoed down the South Nahani River, with the exception of one body found the following month, trapped beneath the rapids. None of them were ever seen again either. Now today, Nahani National Park Reserve remains one of the least visited parks. It is highly inaccessible, reached only by water or air, meaning that it sees only around 1,000 visitors each year, give or take. In some ways, this is a tragedy. The park is undeniably beautiful. In other ways, it may be for the best. If there were more visitors, who knows how many more might actually fall victim to the dark forces of the Headless Valley. While famous for its jaw-dropping waterfalls, majestic canyons, and roaring whitewater rapids, its 12,000 square miles enjoys a more sinister reputation. The Nahani Valley has long been regarded as one of the most mysterious places on all of Earth. I mean, for hundreds of years, if not millennia, people have held that something beyond human understanding snakes through its forests and prowls its canyons. There are stories of tall, hairy giants waiting to abduct the unwary in the forest. There are tales of prehistoric creatures, from dinosaurs to dire wolves, on the hunt for their next meal. Perhaps worst of all, there are rumors of malevolent spiritual forces. Now, Nahani National Park Reserve has a reputation for inexplicable disappearances and deaths. Some bodies are found lacking their heads, while others are found intact, but their cause of death ultimately remains unclear. Still, others vanish without a trace. And the most important question, will you be one of them? Imagine this. You're a 67-year-old Baptist minister chopping wood on the fringes of the Ocala National Forest, when suddenly you catch sight of a massive hair-covered beast standing menacingly among the palmetto bushes. The overwhelming stench of its presence makes you question your sanity, but there's no mistaking the sheer size and terrifying appearance of this mysterious creature. But let's go back to the beginning. In early October of 1977, a 22-year-old man was hitchhiking on US 441, around half a mile from the quaint town of Bellevue, Florida. The area was known for its light forest land, the perfect cover for mysterious creatures to lurk in the shadows. And unbeknownst to the young man, a terrifying experience awaited him, because as he walked along the road, a nauseating smell filled the air, a smell so strong it couldn't be ignored. And suddenly, a dark, hairy, upright figure briefly appeared before vanishing back into the woods. Now, the young man was left to wonder what in the world he had just witnessed deep within the Everglades of Florida. Now, just a couple of days later, another unsettling event occurred in Apopka. A security guard named Donnie Hall was working at a nursery when something large, powerful, covered in gray-reddish fur, physically attacked him, tearing off his shirt. And in a frantic attempt to defend himself, Donnie fired his gun to no avail. The beast, whatever it was, seemed impervious to his efforts and disappeared as quickly as it had struck. Now, these events garnered some attention from the press, locals, and even the police, prompting the Florida Game and Freshwater Commission to look into the matter. They sent an investigator to examine a set of suspicious tracks found at the Apopka nursery. The tracks had an undeniable human likeness, but they seemed too large and oddly shaped to belong to a person. The authorities dismissed the tracks as man-made. They were unable to fathom that a mysterious creature could really be lurking in the depths of Florida, leaving behind these bizarre footprints. Now, 3 years later, in 1980, the small town of Altoona was buzzing with excitement over a strange creature found in the swamps. The local authorities found gigantic-sized 18 footprints in remote parts of the Ocala National Forest. The town was then divided, some believing it to be a hoax, while others, like Lake County Sergeant D. Kirby, believed that the tracks indicated a massive creature weighing around 1,000 pounds and standing between 10 to 12 feet in height. The footprints were far too intricate and realistic to have been made by a simple wooden fake. As the debate went on, reports of encounters with this mysterious creature continued to surface, and it seemed that this mysterious creature had taken residence in the swamps and forest of Florida. Now, at this point, its presence was undeniable, with countless individuals sharing their own terrifying stories of this bizarre creature. And as more and more encounters began to be reported, evidence began to accumulate, and curiosity grew about this strange, elusive creature. And it soon became apparent that the people of Florida were not dealing with just an average, unexplained cryptid. Finally, the identity of the mysterious creature had revealed itself. It was none other than the infamous skunk ape, a bipedal, hair-covered beast that earned its name due to the horrific odor it emitted. The skunk ape had been living in the swamps of Florida, Arkansas, and North Carolina, with Florida being the epicenter of most sightings. Now, this being was thought to be related to Bigfoot, yet distinctly different due to its smaller size and stature and the unique habitat it chose to inhabit. People often wondered if it was a smaller version of Bigfoot that had adapted to the unique landscape of Florida. Now, in a previous episode, my father actually shared with us an incredible story about his encounter with the Florida skunk ape. As if that wasn't enough to blow our minds, he then told us about how his younger brother had stumbled upon a skunk ape cavern deep in the southern Everglades. Now, even the Seminole and the Miccosukee tribes has said that the skunk ape has roamed the Everglades for hundreds of years, long before any European settlers ever arrived. They have passed down stories of a mysterious creature they call the Eskikapkaki, which roughly translates to furry tall man or hairy giant. The earliest known account of a skunk ape was actually recorded back in 1818 in southwestern Florida. Reports began to emerge of a man-sized monkey seen raiding food stores and following fishermen along the shoreline. Now, this strange creature inspired fear and curiosity among all who heard its tales. Now, the year was 1929, and the Florida Keys had just seen an incredible feat: the Perky Bat Tower, standing tall over the Keys, a beacon in the night. But something else was attracted to its construction as well, something that shook the tower and drove off the bats before returning into the wilderness. People who witnessed this mysterious beast described it as ape-like, leaving many to wonder what kind of being could have been so bold as to take such a magnificent structure and try to tear it down. But in the early 70s, 2 Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies were out on patrol in a nearby grove one night, and suddenly they heard something moving through the trees, and their flashlights caught the glint of a pair of eyes staring back at them. It was an ape-like creature. The deputies Marvin Lewis and Ernie Milner knew they had to act fast, so they pulled out their firearms and began firing into the darkness as this thing started running away from them. And as it disappeared, all that remained were some strange prints and snagged hair on a barbed wire fence that had been pushed down. Now, these events kicked off what proved to be a rash of skunk ape sightings in Broward County and its surrounding areas. You had multiple eyewitnesses reporting nocturnal encounters with an ape-like creature between 5 and 7 feet tall, dark red to black fur, and this strange beast even made it to the local newspaper, earning itself the nickname Skunk Ape all across the state of Florida. Now, another interesting case is Charles Stockman, and he had seen too many things in his time in the Vietnam War. He was a veteran after all, and a former police officer. But even with all that experience, nothing would have prepared him for the events that took place on July 14th, 1977, when him and his 13-year-old son Charlie went out to explore the mangroves behind their home, because little did they know what strange discoveries awaited them there. The two of them set off into the mangrove with one goal in mind: to find rare bottles amongst the lush green landscape. Now, as Stockman and his son traipsed through the mangroves, the salty sea breeze washing over them, something strange stirred in the shadows ahead. Stockman was certain that he'd startled it. An ominously dark patch of fur had appeared out of nowhere, and he could now smell its musky odor only several feet away, like a dog that hadn't been bathed in a year and had just been rained on. Now, he knew it couldn't be an ordinary animal, because this thing was huge. Its head and shoulders were enormous, it was 8 or 9 feet tall, and it must have weighed easily 500 pounds if not more. It's a big boy. And then there was this eerie wail to contend with, a sound unlike anything they'd ever heard before. It was the skunk ape. Stockman couldn't believe his eyes. He had heard about the legends about this mysterious creature, but never expected to see it with his own 2 eyes. Now, he and his son watched in stunned silence as the thing lumbered away back into the thick foliage. Now, for weeks, the Stockman lived in fear as this mysterious skunk ape lured around their home. But it wasn't just the Stockmans who encountered this thing. An unidentified neighbor also claimed to have seen it lurking near the property's edge. When it was spotted crouched beneath the cover of their shed, Charles actually called the police for help, and a Deputy Bill Haas from the sheriff's substation on Plantation Key was a man accustomed to strange occurrences, but nothing could prepare him for what he found in Stockman's home. When he received the call, he was a little skeptical of the creature's sighting, but knew that it had to be investigated. Now, upon arriving at the scene and initially investigating, he reported no sign of any unusual activity. But Sergeant Rondell Chin of the sheriff's office and Captain Jack Gillen from the Marine Patrol also arrived and soon realized that something was definitely amiss in this small town. These people are truly scared to death, Chin observed. The officers agreed that if it was a joke, someone's liable to get hurt. Haas and the other officers went around the area, questioning witnesses, but nobody could provide any really useful information. The mystery of the creature sighting remains unsolved to this day, leaving Deputy Bill and his fellow officers scratching their heads in bewilderment. Now, it was shortly after these events that Leslie Stockman and her family on the coast of Key Largo underwent their own set of bizarre circumstances. Now, everything was fine until she was suddenly startled awake at 3 a.m. by the sound of limbs snapping and breaking, as if something big was walking through them outside her bedroom window. Now, peering through, she saw 2 bright, colorless eyes that seemed to be reflecting the light from the backyard. She could make out the other silhouette of an immense shoulder and head above the 8-foot bush, 30 feet away from her bedroom window. Whatever it was, she claimed it had evil intentions. Now, incredibly frightened by this, she quickly rounded up her 3 young children, fled to Homestead in search of safety, never to return to their Key Largo home again. She was that petrified. Meanwhile, Leslie's husband stayed behind, determined to take the creature down with his own shotgun. "It'll take a neck shot to bring him down," Stockman had said. "I've heard about black bears getting shot 3 to 4 times and still getting away, and this thing is bigger than any bear." But what was this mysterious creature? We can only speculate, because whatever it was, its threatening presence had driven Leslie's family out of their home in Key Largo that night. No one could have imagined such an eerie encounter in the quiet coastal town. Now, unfortunately for the Stockmans, they were never able to answer this question or catch sight of the beast again. Unknowingly, this small discovery would unravel a story that actually made headlines throughout the nearby town of St. Pete Times, the Reporter, and Palm Beach Post. The local community was shaken, and people began speculating about what lurked within the swamps surrounding their homes. Now, as the sun sets over Florida's dense swamps and murky forests, the air is thick with mystery and intrigue, and the chilling accounts of the skunk ape continues to baffle both locals and investigators alike. Are these eyewitness accounts just folklore, the product of possibly vivid imaginations, or is there truly some elusive creature hiding in plain sight? We now turn to you, our fellow explorers of the unknown. What do you believe lurks in the shadows of Florida's wilderness? Let me know your thoughts and theories, but remember, as you venture into the world of the unexplained, you might just find the truth is stranger than fiction. There's something in the skies above us, and it might not be what you think, because you're probably thinking UFOs, right? Well, today's episode explores something a little stranger that's really going to make you think. In 2017, a Cindy Voivoda and her husband had attended a paranormal gathering on Mackinac Island, located in the state of Michigan. The event included a Halloween costume party. Now, Cindy, who was a lifelong UFO fan, decided to dress up as an alien along with her husband. Her husband decided to go as Giorgio Tsoukalos of Ancient Aliens fame. "I've always wanted to see a UFO," she would later write. "I imagined a shiny, silver disc-shaped craft, but that was the farthest thing from what I actually saw when I had my first UFO sighting." As the party drew to a close around midnight, Cindy and her husband had decided to relax a bit among the rows of Adirondack chairs out on the lawn in front of the Mission Point Hotel. A meteor shower was supposed to happen that very evening, and both of them hoped to catch a glimpse of a shooting star, or maybe even two. But what they saw was far stranger. Both of them simultaneously announced that they had spotted something up above. Cindy described it as a massive object taking up 1/3 of the sky and traveling from one horizon to the other, straight across the sky. However, it was not your traditional flying saucer, because Cindy went on to say that she saw what I can only describe as an organic, orange-colored jellyfish-like creature with tentacles. I say organic because I believe it was not a spaceship, but a living being. After their shared sighting, Cindy and her husband had compared notes, so to speak. "I was shocked to hear that what he saw was completely different," she said. He described the creature as a thunderbird, or massive Native American bird. He said it was dark in color and could see its wings flapping. Although the size was the same, the description itself was very different than mine. But just what did Cindy and her husband see? It certainly didn't seem like a structured craft. Was something playing with their minds, making Cindy see one thing and making her husband see something else entirely? That's one important takeaway from Cindy's story, regardless of which of them was more accurate. The UFO that they witnessed seemed more organic than any type of machine. I mean, most folks think that the UFO topic is settled. Flying saucers are extraterrestrial vehicles from outer space. But in reality, this idea is just one of dozens of alternate hypotheses that researchers have put forth to explain UFOs. One of the less popular ideas, but no less fascinating, argues that UFOs are actually atmospheric life forms living among the clouds. Now, interestingly, the idea of atmospheric life forms seem to have gained popularity in recent years. In fact, some films have recently used the idea of sky creatures to great effect. Spoiler alert for Jordan Peele's 2022 horror film Nope. The UFO isn't a vehicle, but rather a living creature, feasting on livestock and human beings. Now, many critics applauded Jordan Peele's originality. What they didn't realize is that the idea is actually quite old. The November 1913 issue of the Strand magazine actually featured a submission written by Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The science fiction story was entitled The Horror of the Heights and portrayed monsters high in Earth's atmosphere that attacked and killed pilots. Now, the idea isn't purely fictional, however. A number of sightings like Cindy's support the possibility, and these stretch back to the earliest days of the UFO era. In fact, an argument could even be made that the very first flying saucer sighting actually involved, well, not extraterrestrial craft, but these weird Lovecraftian sky beasts, or so as we call them. But on June 24th, 1947, a Kenneth Arnold went down in history for inadvertently coining the term flying saucer. Above Mount Rainier in Washington state, he observed what he described as 9 craft flying all in formation, high up in the air. He said that they flew erratic, like a saucer if you skip it across the water. His words spread and changed through the media, becoming the term flying saucer. However, Arnold was always a bit circumspect regarding exactly what these objects represented. Besides the possibility of vehicles, he entertained a number of theories throughout his life, including the idea that they might be somehow the connection between the living and the dead. Now, Kenneth Arnold expressed one of his wilder ideas in a 1959 interview with a reporter from the Denver Post. Arnold said that he was starting to suspect that UFOs were actually living organisms just in the atmosphere, that they have the power to change their density and appearance. In fact, I believe this idea would later be revisited numerous times, including Lazar, and even at the time of this recording, one of Joe Rogan's latest interviews with a man by the name of Bill Ottman, who runs the company Minds.com, even had a very brief conversation in the 3-hour podcast about ships and UFOs could be potentially what they refer to as post-biological. But I don't want to get off on a tangent. That is a whole other thing we can get into for another episode. Let's roll back to Kenneth Arnold for a second, as he was expressing the possibility once entertained by no less than the United States government. In the aftermath of his 1947 sighting, the U.S. Air Force actually organized Project Sign to investigate the UFO problem. Now, the study was approached by a Pennsylvanian researcher, John Philip Besser, who suggested that flying saucers were actually living intelligences composed of a highly attenuated substance, capable of materialization and dematerialization, whose propellant is a form of telekinetic energy. Talk about word salad. As evidence for his claims, Besser pointed to anomalous falls from the sky, reported for hundreds of years. Many of these include falls of blood, meat, and personal effects, as in the 2022 film Nope. As disturbing as that sounds, could these be leftovers from an atmospheric life form dining on human beings? Maybe. Speculation is all fine and good, but what about actual sightings? I mean, that's why we're here. Well, ever since Kenneth Arnold's encounter, UFOs appearing more like life forms than vehicles have haunted our very skies. The one name most closely associated with the idea of atmospheric life forms is New Zealand author Trevor James Constable. Now, Constable championed this possibility as an explanation for UFOs and charmingly called these monsters critters. Constable even used infrared film to capture images of what he claimed were these critters. And no, I'm not talking about the 80s movie. Constable believed that these photographs showed that his critters were unicellular life forms, like amoebas. They existed in a plasma state, neither solid, liquid, nor gas, and were primarily composed of calcium and fluids. While normally hidden from human eyes, in the infrared range of the electromagnetic spectrum, from time to time, they occasionally take on a more visible appearance, glowing red or orange, and are mistaken for extraterrestrial craft. Their ability to slip into the infrared spectrum to Constable explained how UFOs manage to suddenly disappear and reappear. Now, one of the cases that Constable cited occurred to American aviation enthusiast A. Don Wood Jr. Now, one afternoon in 1925, Wood was flying with 4 others when they landed on the Mesa in Nevada. Wood said this: "While walking about the top of this place, we noticed something coming in for a landing. It was roughly 8 feet across and was round and flat like a saucer. The undersides were a reddish color. It skidded to a stop about 30 feet away. This next you won't believe, and I don't care, but it's the truth. We walked up to the thing, and it was like some animal like we never saw before. It was hurt, and as it breathed, the top would rise and fall, making a half-foot hole all around it like a clam opening and closing. Quite a hunk had been chewed out of one side of this rim, and a sort of metal-looking froth issued. When it saw us, it breathed frantically and rose up only a few inches, only to fall back to earth again. It was moist and glistened on the top side. We could see no eyes or legs. After a 20-minute rest, it started pulsating once more. We stayed 10 feet away, and so help me, the thing grew as bright as all could get out, except where it was hurt. It had a mica-like shell body. It tried to rise up again, but sank back again. Then we saw a large round shadow fall on us. We looked up and ran. Coming in was a much larger animal, 30 feet across. It paid no attention to us, but settled itself over the small one. 4 sucker-like tongues settled on the little one, and the big one got so dazzling bright, you could not look at it. Both rose straight up and were out of sight in a second. They must have been traveling 1,000 miles an hour to get so high so fast. When we walked over there was an awful stench, and the frothy stuff the little one had bled looked like fine aluminum wire. There was more frothy, wiry stuff in a 30-foot circle where the big one had breathed. This stuff finally melted in the sun and we took off. So help me, this was an animal. I have never told this before as we knew no one would believe us. I only write now because this animal would be one big 30-foot light if seen at night. I don't expect belief, but I simply had to write. Dawn Wood's story is terrifying because it implies an entire ecosystem unfolding invisibly directly above our heads. Sometimes trace evidence suggests the possibility of atmospheric life forms. For example, on September 26, 1950, a pair of law enforcement officers in Philadelphia had spotted something strange in the sky. Now they watched as the object lowered itself into a nearby field. After calling for backup, the policemen went to investigate the landing site. Instead of a craft, they found a bizarre 6-foot-long mass. It seemed to be some sort of gelatinous substance and evaporated within 30 minutes, just as in Dawn Wood's case from 1925. Another noteworthy case unfolded in Frisco, Texas in 1979. On the evening of August 10th, a resident watched a peculiar light descend into the vicinity of a neighbor's house. Now, the very next day, the homeowner, a Miss Sybil Christian, found a trio of purple blobs near the site. After the first evaporated in the sunshine, the other 2 were collected and sent away for analysis. It was determined to be industrial waste. Okay. Though the witnesses remained steadfast that it must be something far stranger. Human beings have lost touch with our surroundings. Many of us live in the safety of cities, where we all have pushed all of nature's threats far from the safety of our homes. What if we're simply bottom feeders clinging to the floor of a vast atmospheric ocean above our heads? That idea alone should terrify you. Tales of paranormal activity have flooded the internet since its inception. In the 90s, when the internet was in its infancy, bulletin boards were flooded with tales of UFOs and secret underground bases and monsters, and the early 2000s saw a rise in reports of Bigfoot. Now, in the 2010s, it seemed as if every day brought a new report of skyquakes. I mean, it's almost as if every era has its own favorite phenomenon. And now in the 2020s, the web is inundated with reports of skinwalkers. However, in the midst of all the hysteria, there are some accounts that go beyond the usual videos of strange screams in the night or even oddly behaving animals. Tales where people see firsthand something that sounds straight out of the indigenous legend. One witness had a terrifying experience to share from her extended family, one whom we will call Leisha, and is of the Navajo ancestry. Now, she lives on the Navajo reservation in a small rural community. So small, in fact, that many homes do not even have electricity. One evening, Leisha's aunt and 2 uncles were home alone. Her grandparents had left to attend a tribal meeting. Since their home was one of the ones without electricity, when night fell, the darkness was complete and total. This meant that there was only about an hour or so to get ready for bed after sunset. Now, sometime during this hour prep, Leisha's aunt and uncles heard something outside the house. It sounded like somebody was out in the yard moving something really heavy. The oldest of the 2 uncles glanced out the window, and to his surprise, he saw someone standing alongside the family pickup truck with one of the doors wide open. Now, this was unusual, since their nearest neighbor was miles away. No one would have crossed the desert on foot, yet there was someone rummaging around through the cab of the truck. So Leisha's aunt and uncles were alarmed. One of them took their rifles, and the other stood alongside the door, ready to throw it open. And when they did, the rifle sights fell upon the figure. The trespasser noticed the firearm, but seemed completely unperturbed. Instead, it began steadily walking toward the house. So Leisha's uncle pulled the trigger, scoring a direct hit. The figure pressed pressed on, and as it did so, the overwhelming stench of a rotten corpse drifted on the desert breeze in their direction. The odor was so overwhelming that it made Alicia's aunt gag. The uncle continued firing at the shadow as it crept closer. Nothing seemed to stop the figure's slow, steady march toward the house, and just then a glimmer of hope appeared. There, across the dust and sand, shone a pair of headlights. Alicia's grandparents were coming home, and she described what had happened next. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with a gun. My grandfather got out of the car, and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. So my grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandmother chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure. The truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandmother was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name. It will kill them. The fact that Skinwalkers can be defeated by directly confronting them appears in another story. This one shared by a Navajo man named Joe. Joe also lived on the res, along with his parents and two brothers. Now, according to Joe, one evening, he and his siblings were left alone while their parents went to a tribal feast. Sometime after sunset, he claimed that everyone noticed a commotion coming from the family's dogs outside. Their first instinct was to dismiss the sound, as there was probably just some coyotes out there riling up the dogs. However, sometime in the middle of the night, Joe felt the call of nature, and the only bathroom was an isolated outhouse. For some reason, perhaps he needed to go too, Joe enlisted his brother to accompany him outside. So they grabbed their flashlights and they headed out the door. And within moments, they knew something was wrong. One of the dogs began whining loudly and then fell quiet. The entire landscape followed suit, descending into an uncanny silence. Not even the livestock could be heard. And then without warning, one of the dogs lapsed into a fit of rage near the pickup truck. So Joe swung the beam of his flashlight in the direction of the sound, and it fell upon something terrifying. A shockingly tall man leaned against the roof of the vehicle. The stranger looked at the dogs for a moment, then kicked at them, sending them scattering. Next, it turned its head in Joe's direction, and Joe said this: it had a pure white face, like a full moon, two burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk toward me with long strides until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was going on. I also noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and he smelt like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak, and the Skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm out toward my brother's head, and something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. Joe said that this rage allowed him to break free of the Skinwalker's hypnotism. He raised raised his arms and bared his teeth, channeling the ferocity of a wild animal. The Skinwalker growled, which only made Joe angrier. He stood there trying to intimidate the intruder until at last the Skinwalker's grin faded. Maybe it smelt what his brother left in the outhouse. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it, Joe explained. It fell backwards and ran away into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were now dim and dull, its smile now long since gone. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. Now, our final tale comes from a half Hopi, half Navajo witness, whom we'll refer to as Tate. Like other people with indigenous ancestry, Tate was hesitant to tell his Skinwalker story, but nonetheless felt compelled to share an encounter from when he was a teenager. Tate was driving around the reservation with his 9-year-old brother and their dog right around dusk, and it was time to head back to their grandmother's house. And as they began the return journey, they turned on the radio to enjoy a little bit of music, and shortly after that, Tate spotted something moving in the scrub up ahead, on the right-hand side of the road. He suspected that this was nothing more than one of the free-range sheep on the reservation, but he kept an eye out just in case it decided to dart in front of the vehicle, but thought nothing of it as he drove on by. Now, the moment when he passed where the bushes were moving, Tate felt what he described as a dark feeling of fear and dread, and he has tried many times to remember exactly what happened next. Disturbingly, he only recalls flashes. He saw something appear in the rearview mirror, very tall, very skinny, covered with some kind of hair or fur. It was running after the vehicle on 2 legs. Tate said that whatever it wasn't a normal human or human at all. His brother began crying. Tate sped up the car, sending it careening over the uneven dirt road. The figure kept drawing nearer, no matter how fast they went. And so he's driving. Tate's brother yells, "It's coming up on your side!" And Tate said that he was so frightened, he simply wanted to die then and there. And Tate finished the story by saying this: "I remember speeding around a bend in the road and seeing a car coming towards us in the opposite direction. At that moment, I felt instant relief and felt that whatever was following us was gone. Shaken up but alive, we made it to Grandma's house, wondering what the hell had just happened. We ran inside, not looking back, hoping that whatever was chasing us had not followed us home." As we told my grandma about our experience, she didn't even seem too surprised, which surprised us. She continued by repeating stories that we had already heard at one point or another about black magic, witches, and something that the Navajos called Yi Nadlushi, or skinwalkers. Needless to say, I don't even want to look out any of the windows at all at night. As a matter of fact, I never drove on the reservation at night until I was 21 years old. For those of you who aren't aware, skinwalkers are witches or warlocks from tribal Navajo belief. They are feared more than just about anything else, as they are capable of inflicting great harm, including disease and other forms of bad medicine. Now, they are closely associated with a variety of animals, including but not limited to coyotes and other tricksters. They might even assume the form of these animals to inflict their death and destruction. Among the cultures that believe in them, skinwalkers and similar witches are rarely spoken of for 2 primary reasons. Number 1, tribes people often feel that outsiders will not treat the subject with the nuance and respect it deserves. And 2, to even mention a skinwalker brings unwanted supernatural attention. This has led to an internet subculture where things are often identified as skinwalkers, despite bearing little to no resemblance to actual Navajo lore. Now, despite the prohibition on sharing details with outsiders, more and more skinwalker tales emerge each year, and with each new story, a terrifying picture emerges. If true, these are not simply spooky campfire stories. They suggest a reality completely at odds with the safety promised by the modern world. You know, an existence where something ancient, active, and truly evil exists, lurking at the fringes of our very perception. We all remember it. The slap heard round the world. On March 27, 2022, Will Smith ascended the stage of the 94th Academy Awards to smack host Chris Rock square in the face. But the reason for this attack was apparent enough to anyone watching. Chris Rock had just told a joke at the expense of Will Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett Smith. But amidst all the controversy, seasoned thespians suspected something else was at play. A 400-year-old curse invoked seconds earlier by Chris Rock. Now, mere moments before making his joke about Jada, Chris looked to actor Denzel Washington and, referencing Denzel's movie from earlier in the year, said Macbeth loved it. It seemed innocent enough, but to many actors, this was a dangerous transgression, because for centuries, people have harbored a superstition that the name of William Shakespeare's famous tragedy should rarely be spoken. Many refuse to use the name, especially when in a theater, as Chris Rock did. Instead, they refer to Macbeth as the unmentionable. That play, Macbeth, or the Scottish King. Braver souls might dare to say the Scottish play, the Bard's play, or Shakespeare's Scottish tragedy. To speak the actual title aloud brings with it certain doom.
Macbeth, 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 Macbeth.
There exist verified accounts of actors who do nothing more than quote from Macbeth and suffer all manner of tragedies. Food poisoning, car crashes, strokes, broken bones, or even forgetting entire speeches while on stage performing. For example, in 1973, actors in Antony and Cleopatra at Bankside Theater shouted a speech from Macbeth just to see if the curse was real. What followed next was a vicious storm that dropped so much water the canvas roof began to sag. Lightning then short-circuited the theater's power. The audience barely evacuated before the roof collapsed, leading to a cancellation of the theater's entire 1974 season. Actors also consider it unlucky to use props from other Macbeth productions. They regularly refuse to use cloaks, helmets, or furniture ever involved in the play. As further evidence, superstitious folk point to an entire timeline of misfortunes surrounding productions of the Macbeth. These disasters can be traced back to the first performance of the play. Hal Berridge, the child actor cast in the role of Lady Macbeth, fell ill without warning, causing, according to some, William Shakespeare himself to take the role. The performance used actual blood and entrails from a butcher shop. After the performance, King James I, who was in attendance, was so disgusted by the display that he forbade any more productions for 5 years. Macbeth was eventually performed in a rewritten version. Now, during its production, this time, however, England suffered one of the worst storms in all of its history, killing 500 sailors, demolishing Bristol, and severely damaging London. When it finally restaged in 1721, the cast actually attacked the audience with their prop swords for poking fun at them. A 1794 production led to an actor nearly dying from a near-fatal stab wound. And over the centuries, countless actors found their careers ended in an untimely fashion from a poor performance in Macbeth. And one of the most famous manifestations of the curse in the modern era had occurred in 1849. In fact, a bloody event known as the Astor Place Riot can be directly attributed to Macbeth. To understand how, we need to set up a little backstory though. The year prior, famous American actor Edwin Forrest starred in a touring production of Macbeth in England. It was heavily criticized by British actor William Macready. Turnabout is fair play. William took his own production to America in 1849 to protest the way he had been mistreated. Edwin staged his own production across the street. When William came to Boston, the rivalry between the two had simmered, and when William took the stage at the Astor Place Opera House in New York, angry Edwin Forrest fans showed up in full force, and they assaulted William with tomatoes, sending him out onto the street embarrassed. The whole affair evolved into a full-fledged riot so widespread and violent that the army had to be called in. At its height, 20,000 people caused havoc in the Manhattan streets. Soldiers were ordered to fire above the crowd, but mishearing the command, instead discharged their weapons into the mob, killing 31 people on the spot. Another 120 were injured. Another famously ill-fated production was the 1937 revival at London's Old Vic. Now, the director and actress playing Lady Macbeth were both severely bruised in a car accident. The founder and director of the theater had her dog killed by a car right around the same time. Now, by the time the dress rehearsal rolled around, none of these sets fit, and the lead actor, Laurence Olivier, had lost his voice. The premiere had to be postponed. When the replacement actor arrived, he invited Olivier on stage to be acknowledged, and after Olivier stood, a stage weight plummeted downward and smashed his seat to bits, an accident that would have traumatically injured him only moments before. As a result, the actress playing Lady Macbeth had a heart attack and died on the opening night. Gee, this doesn't sound like a good play, does it? When Laurence Olivier took the role again, his sword shattered one evening and hit an audience member. The spectator then died from a heart attack as well. And if that wasn't enough for the cherry on top, the production was then transferred to a new theater, and it was a flop. The Old Vic decided to stage Macbeth again in 1954. This guy just doesn't know when to stop. This time, they took it on the road, where the company manager broke both legs in an automobile accident, an electrician who suffered third-degree burns, and a member of the crew attempted suicide. This is getting out of hand, folks. Now, going back a little bit to 1948, actress Diana Wynyard played Lady Macbeth. Now, she decided to perform the character's famous sleepwalking scene with her eyes closed and ended up falling 15 feet. Luckily, she survived and managed to finish the show. Another famous actor missed a day of rehearsal for the first time ever due to the Macbeth curse. Charlton Heston had taken on the role in an open-air production in Fort St. Catherine, Bermuda. This was during the lead-up to opening night, and he too suffered a nasty motorcycle crash and took several days off to recuperate. When he returned, his first performance ended in disaster. Charlton mounted a horse, then quickly ran off stage shouting, "Get them off me! Get them off me!" Well, it turned out that someone, for whatever reason, had dipped his tights in kerosene. This, combined with the heat from the stage lights and the sweat of the horse, left him with serious burns across his legs and groin. The presence of kerosene on Charlton's pants was due to the fact that the extravagant production culminated in the fiery destruction of a castle doused in the flammable substance. At the same performance, the cast went to light the castle on fire, only to have a high wind blow across the open-air theater, sending flames and smoke into the audience and causing a panic. Thankfully, no one died in the ensuing stampede. A 1967 production at Stratford found crew members dismissing the curse as mere superstition. Everything went well until someone working in the theater offices succumbed to a fatal heart attack. The director then developed shingles and had to remain in a darkened room for 6 weeks. The play was postponed, tickets refunded, and when actors finally took the stage once more, it was in the midst of a horrific heat wave that left everyone agonized in their costumes. And worst of all, it turns out that the crew's caterer had to be replaced at the last minute by Sbarro. Now, colleagues warned against a 1970 production at the Liverpool Repertory Theatre. The second week of rehearsals found the actor playing Macbeth struck in the eye with a prop sword. Ow! Another actor who had just played Macbeth was asked to step in. He had to decline because of a head injury suffered in his own production. Now later, 5 understudies had to step in to play Lady Macbeth following the lead's influenza diagnosis. Besides the Will Smith Chris Rock slap, one of the most famous recent manifestations of the Macbeth curse happened on the set of Ari Aster's 2018 film Hereditary. Now, according to Aster, he was instructed not to say the name of William Shakespeare's Scottish play out loud because of some superstitious theater legend. I smugly announced the name, and then one of our lights burst during the shooting of the following scene. Why so much fear over a simple bit of dramatic theater? The most popular belief is that Shakespeare himself inadvertently cursed Macbeth. Some of the most important figures in Macbeth are three witches. They are the characters who famously recite double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. They also describe several spells throughout the course of the play, told to chilling effect. Now, some believe that these spells and incantations represent something much more powerful than simple poetic license. There is a belief that William Shakespeare included genuine magical spells in his play, rather than something he just invented. As the belief goes, covens of actual witches were angered by Shakespeare revealing their proprietary methods, and as a result, placed a curse on the Scottish tragedy that continues to this very day. Of course, for every believer, there's a skeptic. Some people say that the popularity of Macbeth is the actual source of its bad luck. Let me explain. Since many believe that anyone putting on the play is guaranteed to have a surefire success on their hands, many theater companies are drawn to programming it. This must surely be the case for any theater company suffering financially. Now, this means that the production might be plagued by lax safety standards, since they cannot afford enough personnel or precautions. A dying company performing Macbeth as a last-ditch effort might close shortly thereafter, leading to an association between the play and misfortune. Now, interestingly enough, actors have had multiple methods to dispel Macbeth's bad luck. Some believe that Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is famously lucky. Sometimes, to counteract the Macbeth curse, it is recommended that actors should recite a line from this play. Fair thoughts and happy hours attend on you. Other lines include reciting bits of Hamlet, angels and ministers of grace defend us, or A Midsummer Night's Dream, if we shadows have offended. Another method to dispel the curse involves exiting the building, circling it 3 times, spitting over your left shoulder, cursing, and waiting to be invited back inside. A similar method involves spitting in a circle 3 times, then spitting and cursing. Actor Donald Sinden claimed it is not Macbeth, but another play that true thespians fear. He said, "More actors have died during performances of Hamlet than in the Scottish play," as the profession still calls it. It is forbidden to quote from it backstage, as this could cause the current play to collapse and have to be replaced, causing possible unemployment. It's important to remember that plenty of people have performed Macbeth unscathed. Still, it seems like there are a lot of accidents surrounding this one play of Shakespeare's. I mean, who knows? Maybe the play truly is cursed. Or maybe superstition is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe in generating so much anxiety around Macbeth, some sort of latent psychic abilities among actors is activated, bringing down pain and suffering among the cast and crew. Either way, maybe it's best not to quote from the play. If you get the opportunity to perform in a production, maybe give it a second thought. It might save you a lot of toil and trouble.
Something terrifying happened in northern Mexico in the spring of 1992. Miguel was driving along a lonely stretch of road when he noticed someone walking all by themselves. Now, as Miguel drew closer, he was able to tell that the figure was actually a woman bearing a red dress. Both concerned and confused, Miguel slowed his vehicle as he approached the stranger, rolled down his window, and politely asked if she was okay and maybe he could drive her somewhere. Now, the words had barely left his mouth when he noticed one disturbing detail. Below the hem of her skirt, where he expected to see her feet, he actually saw the hindquarters of a goat, complete with hooves. Miguel did not hesitate. He rushed away as fast as he could. When enough distance had passed where he felt safe, he glanced in his rearview mirror, and there was no one to be found, just the lonely expanse of the isolated road. So what did Miguel encounter that day? Now, some people might be fine saying that he just made up the whole story, but others might take the cryptozoological route, saying that the mysterious woman was a human-goat hybrid, a satyr, perhaps. Still, others might suggest that she was an alien. But for thousands of years, one interpretation of stories like Miguel has been favored above all others. He met the devil that day in 1992. Encounters with the devil stretch so far back that we literally can't even say when they began. Human beings have always suspected that, alongside benevolent creative forces, something more evil influences our very own reality. Now, today's idea of Satan, Lucifer, and the devil are kind of a hodgepodge of pagan belief, Abrahamic religion, and early church speculation. While exactly what we call it is up for debate. Now, these names all have their own long, complicated histories. Many people, if not most, believe that a supreme evil does exist. Anyone looking for evidence of the devil simply needs to visit their local food court in their mall. Do you see it? Do you see what Satan has unleashed? The triangular abomination that is Sabaro. According to the Bible, even Jesus himself encountered Satan multiple times. It should come as a little surprise that the devil pops up all throughout early and medieval church history. His influence comes in many forms, from demonic possession to allegedly cavorting with witches at their meetings known as Sabbaths. But it wasn't just practitioners of the dark arts who had these experiences. Saints, seers, and other people deemed holy often encountered the devil themselves. Now, these accounts can be found in the earliest days of the church. In an example that sounds a bit like Miguel's case above, tradition holds that Saint Benedict once encountered Satan, who had transformed himself into an irresistible, beautiful woman. Rather than given to temptation, Benedict flung himself into a thorn bush. Benny, my man, a cold shower would have been more than enough. Another story finds the devil interfering with the construction of the monastery at Monte Cassino. He made one of these stones too heavy to lift, and Saint Benedict intervened, signing the cross over the stone, and then he lifted it easily. Gemma Galgani, a 19th century Italian mystic, venerated as a saint today, had her own struggles with the adversary. In her diary, she wrote this: "This evening I felt I could not collect myself. I said a few evening prayers and went to bed. Slumber was not long in coming when almost instantly a tiny man appeared, all covered in black hair. What a fright! He put his hands on my bed and I thought he wanted to hit me. No, he said. I'm not able to hit you. Don't be afraid." And as he said this, he lay down on the bed. I called Jesus to help me, but he did not come. But this doesn't mean he abandoned me. As soon as I called his name, I felt liberated, but it was sudden. Other times I'd called Jesus, but he had never been ready, like last night. You should have seen the demon afterward, how angry he rolled around on the floor, cursing. He made one last effort to take away the cross I had with me, but then he instantly fell backward. How good Jesus was with me last night. The devil, after the last effort, turned toward me and said that since he had not been able to do anything with me, he wished to torment me the rest of the night. No, I told him. I called my guardian angel, who opened his wings and alighted next to me. He blessed me and the devil ran away. Jesus be thanked. Over the centuries, these ideas mixed with local legends and folk belief. It's important to note that the devil and Satan were once not as inseparable as they are today. For these reasons, many people, including those who claim to be devout Christians, would call upon the devil for aid. Places of transition like Crossroads were considered the devil's domain, and here agreements could be made with him. In fact, one of the most famous examples of one of these crossroad pacts is the story of celebrated Mississippi blues performer Robert Johnson. Johnson's virtuosity was unmatched at the time, and rumor has it that he obtained his infamous abilities from the Prince of Darkness himself. There are several variations of the tale, most agreeing that Johnson, aspiring to be a great musician, set out for the crossroads around midnight. This location is sometimes specified as an intersection near Dockery Plantation. In any case, when Johnson arrived, he was met by a large, dark man who took Johnson's guitar. After tuning it, the devil played a few songs and then returned it to its owner, after which Johnson became one of the most prominent blues musicians. Whether true or not, the Robert Johnson legend fits nicely into a list of very similar transactions over the centuries where people would trade their souls to the devil in exchange for worldly fame, gifts, or fortune. Now, if these stories are to be believed, there have probably been hundreds of millions of visions of the devil in the past 2,000 years alone. These stories often blend with other folklore, tales of fairies, goatmen, even UFOs. Let's take a look at just a few from the 20th century. The Daily Star, a paper out of Lincoln, Nebraska, said that a local resident encountered what he was convinced was the devil in 1922. The witness, whom we'll refer to as Stephen claimed that he saw something descend from the sky only to land on his property. The object was large and spherical, and after it landed, a figure emerged, described as standing around 8 feet tall and devilish looking, maybe devilish good looks. Stephen was a very religious man. Although terrified, he remembered his biblical instruction and mumbled, "Get thee behind me, Satan," and he bravely turned his back on the giant. And as he did so, another object came to rest some distance above the ground. This second object was shaped like a flying saucer. Rather than landing, this second UFO simply hovered there, and Stephen had the impression it was protecting him. The next thing he knew, voices from the airborne object showered down upon him, all quoting passages from the Bible. Glancing behind himself, Stephen saw that the giant became uneasy and took off on foot. The sphere had apparently vanished, but the being itself left behind trace evidence of its existence in the form of hoof marks and damage to a nearby barbed wire fence. The newspaper article claimed that the metal of the fence was left burning hot and severed as if it had been burned through with a welding torch. Now, jumping ahead to 1967, a trio of hunters saw a devilish monster themselves in the woods near Point Isabel, Ohio. The primary witness, whose 15-year-old Perry Adams simply stumbled upon the creatures in the company of his father and uncle. Now, Perry described the devil as a 10-foot tall, light tan color with long arms, pointed ears, and short horns on its head. Perry's father opened fire on the creature, which wailed in pain before simply dissolving in a strange white mist of smoke. Argentina has its own share of devil sightings over the years, and on April 17, 2000, a patrolman in Fria noticed a small figure by the roadside late at night. It looked like a child, hoping to comfort them and perhaps reunite them with their parents. But as the witness approached the figure, something happened. He was almost upon it when it wheeled about to face him, revealing a pair of burning eyes that reminded him of the devil. A similar being was spotted several years prior, around 160 miles away in the Cordoba region. 14-year-old Juan Pablo encountered a short creature while walking along a path more commonly known as Camino de los Duendes, or the Path of Goblins. Now, according to Juan, the creature was dressed in a red jumpsuit and a cap. In one hand, it carried something long like a staff or a walking stick. On July 12th that same year, San Miguel de Tucuman's La Gaceta, a local newspaper, carried another devil encounter. This time, the witnesses were a few policemen who, according to their story, were being treated for shock at a nearby hospital. Sounds like it was a little more than an active imagination. The officers, Luis Rodolfo Aguero and Corporal Miguel Anel Aguero, were joined by fellow policeman Walter Ortega at the time of the incident. They were sleeping at their post near Donde de Varel when a violent noise awoke them. It sounded like someone tromping along the roof above an adjacent room. Walter looked outside to investigate and was instantly whisked into the air by some invisible force. The unseen assailant threw Walter into the branch of a tree, which broke and injured him. The other officers would call for backup, and soon 15 more policemen were now on the scene. But when they arrived, they found Anil sitting in a chair, staring at the ceiling, repeatedly shouting, "There it is! There it is! There it is! Come and get me!" Everybody was profoundly disturbed by the sight. Anil was no gun-shy rookie. He was a veteran with a decade on the force. Yet, even he had seen something that absolutely terrified him. When the other officers finally calmed down, Anil said that he had seen a small figure decked out in green shirt and black pants. The being had a pair of glowing red eyes. It even shared a terrifying message. It said that it had come to collect him on Satan's behalf. These are but a few times in recent years where people claim to have encountered the devil. The stories are nothing short of profoundly disturbing. However, we could take a degree of comfort in an odd sort of way. If supernatural evil exists, then supernatural good must exist as well. If you have even a passing interest in the paranormal, you likely have been made aware in recent years of the UFO videos released by the Pentagon.
Well, if there's a thing, it's rotated.
Now, this compelling footage shows what appears to be unidentified flying objects captured by fighter pilots sent to the investigator radar returns. One of the clips comes from pilots assigned to the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group in 2004 and depicts what many have dubbed the Tic Tac, a white lozenge-shaped object capable of incredible feats of speed and maneuverability.
We're going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots to the west. Oh, thing, dude.
Now, in this encounter, known as the Tic Tac footage, the object soared over the ocean off the coast of Southern California before vanishing from view. Something you may not know about the Tic Tac footage, however, is the impression from pilot David Fravor that something else might have lurked beneath the water below the craft. This led Fravor to speculate in the late 2020 interview with podcaster Lex Fridman that the craft he was tracking might have vanished into the very ocean itself. He said, "Think about it. If you're gonna hide on this planet, what's the least explored spot on the planet? 2/3 of its ocean." Fravor's astute observation fits into a line of ufological speculation that stretches back for several decades. You might be surprised to learn that there are hundreds of cases, perhaps thousands, where flying saucers and other UFOs are seen gathering H2O from a variety of sources. Everything from reservoirs to water towers to natural bodies. Now, alongside these reports are an equal number of unidentified flying objects emerging from or descending into the water, be it a river, a lake, or most commonly, the ocean itself. In their attempt to explain such sightings, ufologists have studied this from every angle. Some, like Carl Feindt in his book UFOs in Water, entertain the possibility that UFOs need water for some undisclosed purpose, which we don't know, and that perhaps extraterrestrials hide their secret bases deep within the world's oceans. Others favor a crypto-terrestrial hypothesis that perhaps these beings never came from the stars, but instead represent another civilization that co-evolved on Earth alongside our very own. One of the best examinations of this possibility is cryptozoologist Ivan T. Sanderson's 1970 book, Invisible Residents. Now, Sanderson wrote, "If a superior technological type of intelligent civilization developed on this planet underwater, they would very likely have gotten much further ahead than we have, having had several millions and possibly up to 1 billion years head start on us, life as we know it having started in at the sea." Now, stories abound of bizarre vehicles seen on, beneath, or entering or leaving the waves. These are known by many names, including mystery submersibles, or most commonly, USOs, unidentified submarine objects. The history of USOs is actually quite old, and it stretches back into antiquity. Even in the modern era, some of our earliest reports are quite dated, stretching back into the 19th century. For instance, on June 18th, 1845, the crew of the brig Victoria actually spotted something strange in the eastern portion of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, as they were watching the waves, a trio of bright glowing objects appeared underwater, only to take off into the sky, where they remained clearly visible for at least 10 minutes. The report was later published 16 years later, by the way, in a report of the British Association. Now, there were multiple witnesses to the incident from a variety of vantage points. One described each craft as 5 times larger than the moon, and all of them sporting an apparatus resembling a sail or streamer. The 3 objects appeared to be somehow tethered to one another. There was also the November 12th, 1887 sighting of an enormous fireball off Cape Race, Newfoundland. The luminous sphere rose out of the sea to a height of 50 feet, where it was witnessed by the crew of the British steamer Siberian. They noted that the object moved against the wind before retreating into the sky, ruling out the possibility of a balloon. Like the 1845 sighting, it was featured in several respected publications, and one of the most famous USOs comes from a report in the July 3rd, 1893 Tacoma Daily Ledger. 2 days earlier, a fishing party camping on Henderson Island, most of whom whom provided their names to the paper, swore they saw something really out of place in the waves after midnight. Now, according to one of the witnesses, since the creation of the world, I doubt if sounds and sights more horrible were ever seen or heard by mortal man. I was in the midst of a pleasant dream when, in an instant, a most horrible noise rang out in the clear morning air, and instantly the whole air was filled with a strong current of electricity that caused every nerve in the body to sting with pain, and a light as bright as that, created by the concentration of many arc lights, kept constantly flashing. At first I thought it was a thunderstorm, but as no rain accompanied it, and as both light and sound came from off bay, I turned my head in that direction, and if it is possible for fright to turn one's hair white, then mine ought to be snow white. For right before my eyes was a most horrible looking monster. By this time, every man in our camp, as well as the men from camp of the surveyors, were gathered on the bank of the stream, and as soon as we could gather our wits together, we began to question if what we were looking at was not the creation of the mind, but we were soon disburdened of the idea, for the monster slowly drew in toward the shore, and as it approached, from its head poured out a stream of water, and it looked like blue fire. All the while, the air seemed to be filled with electricity, and the sensation experienced was as if each man had on a suit of clothes formed of the fine points of needles. One of the men from the surveyor's camp incautiously took a few steps in the direction of the water, and as he did so, the monster darted towards the shore and threw a stream of water that reached the man, and he instantly fell to the ground and lay as though dead. The narrator goes on to explain how one of the men trying to rescue this victim found himself struck down by the electric charge. Everyone fled to the forest amid continuing flashes from the supposed creature before it vanished beneath the waves. The witness, despite insisting that what they saw was a living, breathing creature, described something that sounds much more like a vehicle of some sort. It stretched nearly 150 feet long, 30 feet in circumference at its widest point. Although he thought it was covered with a very coarse hair, the witness said it also sported 6 perfectly round dinner plate-sized eyes on a walrus-like head. Do these sound like eyes to you, or portholes? The fact that nearly its entire body was illuminated, combined with the electric shocks that it discharged, it makes the object sound like something more mechanical than biological, unless we're dealing with a truly enormous, aggressive electric eel. To make it even more machine-like, the description referenced a tail shaped like a propeller that seemed to revolve. USO sightings continued through the early 20th century, including noteworthy reports from Alaska in 1945, the North Atlantic in 1954, and a sighting in a New York lake in Westchester County in 1955. Some reports, especially the more mundane ones, where the objects never leave the water, might have more prosaic explanations. In the 1960s and 70s, for example, the waters around Scandinavia were plagued by unknown submarines which no one could identify. It has been credibly speculated that these were no more than spy submarines from the Soviet Union. The possibility, while no less frightening, is much less exotic than underwater civilizations or alien submarines. It wasn't until the 1970s, though, that USOs took on a more explicitly ufological flavor. One of the most famous accounts even involves an abduction. On January 3rd, 1979, Florida resident, a Filiberto Cardenas, was traveling just north of Miami when his car engine suddenly dies. Now he steps out of his car to check what was wrong, and Filiberto spotted a massive UFO above the car. In full view of everyone, a beam of bright light captured him and pulled him upward into the craft, which then vanished. Now, Filiberto wasn't seen again until 2 hours later. A police officer, William Christian, found him completely disoriented, 16 miles away from where he had disappeared. When at last he recovered, Filiberto told a wild story about meeting 3 human-like aliens aboard a UFO, all of whom wore dark, tight-fitting suits. All of them somehow spoke extremely fluent Spanish and warned him about disasters, both natural and man-made, that's threatened our planet's future. The beings then piloted their craft to a rocky shoreline and submerged beneath the waves. The craft used an enormous fissure in the rock to access an underwater tunnel that terminated in a stunning submerged metropolis. Now, during his time here as a guest, our captive, depending on your perspective, Filiberto met another human being who claimed to have resided with the aliens for years. After undergoing medical procedures in another room, Filiberto was unceremoniously returned to the Miami Metro. Now, I get that this might sound like nothing more than a tall tale, but Filiberto exhibited disturbing medical ailments in the fallout of his experience. Medical professionals located more than 100 prick marks all over his body, as if his skin had been punctured by tiny needles. Additionally, Filiberto endured dramatic swings in his body temperature that often left him covered in sweat, his thirst unquenchable. The USO trend continues into recent years. On July 15th, 2019, footage recorded off the coast of San Diego, California by personnel aboard the USS Omaha showed some sort of sphere in the sky. After gliding along effortlessly, it hovered for roughly 45 seconds, then plunged down into the ocean with a splash. Even though a search was mounted, no one found any craft, nor did they spot any wreckage. The only thing they found were questions. What might be the most recent USO sighting unfolded in Hawaii at the end of 2020. On December 29th, residents throughout Oahu spotted a luminous blue orb in the air above the island. The UFO was recorded by several witnesses, and some of them even hopped in their cars to pursue it. They tracked the orb as long as they could, until at last, after 3 miles, it reached the coast. It headed out to sea, and then without a sound, simply dropped into the ocean. Now, around the same time, another smaller object was also seen ducking behind a mountaintop. Federal Aviation Administration officials had publicly declared that none of the aircraft they were tracking disappeared from radar that night, nor had they received any reports of overdue or missing aircraft. What's interesting about the UFO phenomenon is how nowhere seems off limits. They're in our skies, of course, but are seen on cameras above Earth's atmosphere. UFOs are often seen flying into mountainsides, hinting at subterranean extraterrestrial bases. There are even reports of smaller light phenomena in people's homes. In light of such unprecedented access to every setting, is it really a surprise that UFOs, or more accurately, USOs, seem to swarm on above and beneath the world's oceans? Imagine a quiet romantic evening alone at your home in Enfield, Illinois. You turn the slow jazz on, you're relaxing with your significant other, and suddenly you hear a bizarre scratching sound at the door. You casually get up to go answer it. You open the door expecting there to be a creeper or something, and it's not a person or an animal. Something else entirely. It's got 3 legs, it's otherworldly, and it's got pink eyes staring back at you. Panic starts to set in as this thing now hisses at you like a wildcat before bounding away into the darkness. But before we get any deeper into this tale, let's look back at the beginning. In 1973, residents of Enfield were terrorized by this mysterious being that came to be known as the Enfield Horror. It first surfaced on April 25th. At around 9:30 p.m., a Henry McDaniel and his wife had returned home, where they were met by their 2 children. Now, according to some reports, the McDaniel children shared that they had been frightened in their parents' absence. While they were gone, the children said that something seemed to be scratching at the door, trying to get into the house. I mean, probably a stray cat, right? No. Henry had put little stock in his children's tale. I mean, just suspecting that they were simply the victims of their own overactive imaginations. But 30 short minutes later, he too heard the distinctive sound of claws against the front door. And no, it's not your ex desperate to get back with you. Despite this development, Henry still remained calm. He fully expected to find nothing more than a stray dog or a feral cat on the other side. Now, looking outdoors, however, he found something truly horrifying. He could not tell what it was, only that he had never seen anything like it before in his entire life. Now, in his words, it had 3 legs on it, a short body, 2 little short arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights. It stood 4.5 feet tall and was grayish colored. Now, chillingly, Henry would later compare its body to that of a human being. Before rushing outside, Henry ran and fetched his flashlight and a .22 pistol. This isn't a pistol, this is a rifle, but you get the point. Now, within moments, he opened fires on the creature, right, with his pistol, discharging his firearm 4 times in its direction. Henry would later tell others that he was certain of his accuracy. "When I fired that first shot, I know I hit it," he said. The infield horror did not seem very perturbed by the assault. In response to Henry's shots, it hissed like a wildcat and began bounding away, its 3 legs carrying it across the yard in a series of long, graceful leaps. And before Henry could fire another round, it was heading toward the nearby railroad, where it disappeared from sight altogether. Now, he later estimated that in only 3 jumps, the creature covered up to 50 feet. Now, Henry immediately called law enforcement, and officers arrived at the McDaniel residence. They found a few noteworthy oddities. The siding of Henry's home bore distinct scratches, and most alarmingly, there were peculiar footprints. These were described as similar to a dog's prints, but displayed not 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but 6 toes. Now, notably, 2 sets of tracks spanned 4 inches each, while a third paw print was smaller, a detail which seemed to confirm Henry's description of the mysterious beast having 3 legs. Now, police later described Henry that evening as rational and sober. I mean, that's pretty good, right? I would hope so. For his part, he later told reporters that if anyone managed to find the creature, they will find more than one, and they won't be from this planet, I can tell you that. Now, despite the physical evidence and Henry's straight-faced demeanor, many officers remained skeptical of his claims. I mean, wouldn't you? This is even more surprising, given how just 30 minutes prior, they had received reports of an attack on Henry's 10-year-old neighbor. That boy claimed that the monster had stepped on his tennis shoes, pulling them off and ripping them to shreds. Sounds more like a middle school bully to me. The creature was not reported for another 2 weeks, and for a time it seemed like everyone would forget about the infield horror. However, at 3 in the morning on May 6th, 1973, Henry called WWKI radio station in Kokomo, Indiana, to report that he had spotted the beast yet again near his property. Now, according to Henry, a racket from his neighbor's dog woke him up in the middle of the night, and when he looked outside, he saw, in his words, something moving out on the railroad track, and there it stood. "I didn't shoot at it or anything. It started on down the railroad track. It wasn't in a hurry or anything." Henry said that he watched the animal for several minutes. Rick was prepared though, because not only did he record vocalizations from the creature, but he even took a pot shot at it. Of course, the infield horror ran away to fright another day. A minor monster mania had seized Enfield, Illinois. People from miles around descended on the small town to see this creature. Some even sought to capture or kill this elusive beast. Just 2 days after Henry's radio call, and officers under the direction of a Sheriff Roy Pochard Jr. were called out to investigate reports of gunfire. Now, they found 5 youths, all from out of town, who claimed that they were trying to photograph the infield horror. For protection, they all carried firearms and allegedly were acting out in self-defense. It turned out that they had succeeded in spotting some sort of gray thing running through the woods and had no choice but to open fire. 2 of the 5, Roger Tappy and Mike Mogul of Elwood, Indiana, both claimed to have seen a gray monkey running through the forest, cutting through the underbrush. Now, Sheriff Pochard and his colleagues were skeptical of the monster hunting excuse, instead saying that the men were just out drinking and raising hell, and barely mentioned the infield horror in passing during their interrogation. He charged them all with hunting violations. Now, for a time, Sheriff Pochard wondered if he might have to incarcerate Henry McDaniel himself, if for no other reason than to keep his mouth shut. The monster was drawing far too much attention to his tiny town, and he was sick of the nonsense. These threats had amounted to nothing, however, and failed to dissuade Henry, who was convinced that something strange was going on. Eventually, however, the out-of-town encounters gave up on spotting the Enfield horror, and things returned to normal. Even in spite of the diminished hysteria, a handful of witnesses still claim to see the creature on and off over the years. Now, the Enfield horror has continued to baffle skeptics and cryptozoologists alike. Famed researcher Lauren Coleman investigated the event, including Rick Rainbow's recording of the creature's supposed cries. And he told reporters, "I traveled to Enfield, interviewed the witnesses, looked at the siding of the house the Enfield monster had damaged, heard some strange screeching banshee-like sounds, and walked away bewildered." Some believe that the Enfield horror may actually have precedent in another wave of sightings. They point to stories of the Mount Vernon monster, which appeared in the 1940s in the nearby town of, you guessed it, Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is only 40 miles from Enfield. According to these older reports, a mysterious creature was responsible for several animal mutilations all throughout the region. It was often reported that this creature was moving with a peculiar loping locomotion. From these sparse eyewitness accounts, it seemed to be ape-like. Now, could this be the same creature as the Enfield horror? Today, many regard the Enfield horror as either a misidentification or an example of mass hysteria. Some say that the beast was, in reality, an escaped pet primate. And yet another explanation might be the most popular, and it holds that the creature was an escaped kangaroo. I mean, this certainly helps to explain the Enfield horror's infamous third leg. Perhaps this was a kangaroo tail, or maybe it was just some dude packing some heat, if you know what I'm saying. Now, to make an even more compelling case, Illinois did experience a bizarre wave of kangaroo sightings. Yes, kangaroo sightings in 1974. And many of these encounters were actually corroborated by law enforcement, who were often forced to confront these animals. Look, the primary problem with this solution is that it completely disregards Henry McDaniel's life experience, because as it turns out, Henry had spent some time of his military service in Australia, where he actually, get this, owned a pet kangaroo. And as a result, when presented with the kangaroo explanation, he adamantly declared the creature wasn't a kangaroo. As for mass hysteria, there are indications that some aspects of the story don't quite hold up. Greg Garrett, Henry McDaniel's young neighbor who had his shoes torn by the Enfield horror, later confessed that he had concocted the story to tease Mr. M and have fun with an out-of-town newsman. Greg shared this with researchers from Western Illinois University, who used the Enfield horror case as the centerpiece for a 1978 study into social contagions. Now, according to the head of the study, David L. Miller, it was not solely Henry's story, but rather 3 first-hand reports that got picked up by the news and were simply overblown. The results of their study read this: in this area of southern Illinois, it is not unreasonable to assume Mr. M or the radio news team had actually seen an animal. People we interviewed framed the recent events in these terms. Their accounts admitted the possibility that large dogs, calves, bears, deer, and wild cats had been sighted. Some frames suggested that an exotic pet, such as an ape or kangaroo, was the catalyst for the monster reports. Now, finally, some people tactfully suggest that Mr. M had a notoriously overactive imagination and had probably been shooting at just shadows. In any event, we interviewed only one person who agreed with Mr. M's claims that he had indeed seen a monster from outer space. Unlike a lot of cryptids, the story of the Enfield horror seems largely confined to one singular time and place. Depending upon what you believe, this might indicate a hoax, misidentification, or mass hysteria. It also might mean that this was indeed a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence, when a creature from another world, another dimension, or another reality had slipped into our own world. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Is the Enfield horror real, or is this simply just a matter of a fictitious tale pushed for fame and notoriety? A prospector named Charlie Arizona once settled down for the evening long ago just southeast of Borrego, New Mexico. When suspicious sounds awoke him, his first thought was that an intruder had descended upon his camp. However, the only thing Charlie saw was a light far off in the distance, and Charlie's imagination then turned to the possibility that he was seeing someone lost amidst the mountains, carrying a torch or a flashlight to guide their way. Perhaps Charlie thought someone had found his camp and was looking for safety. Unfortunately, this was not the case. As the light drew near, Charlie saw its terrifying owner in horrific glory. It was a tall, thin, skeletal figure stumbling across the track, and from its rib cage, a light shone like that of a lantern, casting a dim glow in the still night. The figure stood alarmingly tall, over 8 feet. Just when Charlie thought a confrontation was imminent, the Borrego Phantom continued on its way, disappearing behind some rocks. Now, only a few years later, another prospector, this time with a companion, had spotted the same eerie figure. And just like Charlie, they were settled in for the night when a light appeared in the distance, and one of them saw it, a skeleton. The other did not, and refused to believe his partner had witnessed this. All he saw was the light, which in his mind could have easily come from another human being. 1 year later, another witness reported an encounter with the Borrego Phantom at the Vallecito station. Here, rumors of the apparition spread, and today people descend upon the area hoping to catch a glimpse of this terrifying living skeleton. Some even claim to have taken pot shots at the being only to have it stumble onward into the wilderness. Don't think that you're safe from the skeleton creatures at home, because one witness in 2008 had the fight of her life in the safety of her own bedroom, and she reported her experience to a friend of What Lurks Beneath, Barton Nunnally. The witness, whom we will call Samantha, was around 6 years old. She, along with her sister, mother, and mother's boyfriend, had just relocated to a new home in Pleasantville, New Jersey. Unsettlingly, Samantha's bedroom had a door that would lead to the attic. Now, one night while fighting sleep, she finally dozed off around 3 or 4 in the morning. When she woke again, the attic door was wide open, and she tried to rouse her sister, who slept in the same bed, but she remained unresponsive, and suddenly, something moved in the corner of Samantha's vision. Whatever it was stood about 4 or 5 feet above the bed. Although it was difficult to see in the dim light conditions, Samantha blinked, rubbed her eyes, and eventually focused on a terrifying intruder. Samantha said, "What I saw almost made me pee on myself. Looking directly at me through empty eye sockets was a skeleton. It had on a black cape, and the inside was blood red." Samantha realizes how absurd her description sounds, but remains adamant about what she saw. She said that she cowered beneath the covers, too afraid to move. Eventually, she looked again to see if her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the figure remained in place. Samantha told Barton that she mustered up enough strength and ran out of the room, leaving my sister and the ghostly figure, whatever it was, behind. I ran to my mother, told her what had happened. Of course, she didn't believe me, but stayed with me until I fell asleep. Now, to this day, I don't know what it was. Now, tales of living skeletons, or to borrow a term from Barton, skeletoids, thanks buddy, are surprisingly common in our ancient myths and legends. For instance, the Old Testament chapter of Ezekiel features dried human bones that reassemble themselves. Legends in Finland and Sweden speak of Clutchbone, a skeletal phantom whose forehead is said to hold a light that shines perpetually. In the Solomon Islands, a figure known as the Malawato is said to stalk the forest in search of its next victim. Now, in the New World, there are various Native American tribes that do believe in similar skeletoids, including the Ojibwe and Algonquin. They fear a figure known as Baycock or Paguk. This deathly figure is a little more than an animated skeleton. In fact, the Anishinaabe term Bakak literally means skeleton, although this is more of a description of emaciation rather than just bones. The Baycock is said to resemble a skeleton covered in see-through transparent skin with glowing red eyes. It is known for using invisible arrows or a heavy club to attack its victims, whose liver it then devours. Skeletoids also appear in the historical record. In the 13th century, King Alexander of Scotland had his wedding dance interrupted by an animated skeleton that crashed the party. And we're not talking about meth heads here, because in 1875 in Cumberland, Amelia Cranswell had her bedroom invaded by another skeleton. Her brothers rushed to her aid, only to find her lying unconscious in a pool of her own blood, lacerations on her neck and shoulders. And when they looked across the lawn, the spindly figure was fleeing the scene of the crime. In the early 19th century, George Nelson wrote in his journals of a being from Cree mythology known as the Pakak, which, while skeletal like the Baycock, is more like the Wendigo, in the fact that it evolves from a victim of starvation rather than existing as its own entity. In Nelson's account, one of his acquaintances was sleeping one evening after a very successful beaver hunt when he awoke and found, to his horror, a ghastly old man sitting by the campfire. The account reads this: "He had but skin and bone, not the least particle of flesh." According to the story, the witness then woke up his hunting partner. The pair decided to try and appease the specter by offering one of the beavers they had killed. The Pakak seemed uninterested until the men decided to dice the beaver into tiny little pieces, which they tossed into the fire. Now this just seems like a complete waste of meat. Now this seemed to satisfy the creature enough that it departed, never to be seen again. Remember, ladies, if your man is a Pakak, he's a selfish lover. He will not eat the beaver. Another skeletoid type figure that pops up from time to time is the Stickman. Barton Nunnally shares an account from eyewitness Simon Howes. In 1982, when I was a student nurse at Worley Hospital, Brentwood in Essex, England, I encountered a stick person in the grounds of the hospital as I was walking home one night. It loped across the roadway, having been seemingly pressed up against a wall. It stopped when it saw me and raised its arms in fright and quickly walked off into the undergrowth. It was very tall with very thin, extremely long arms and legs, and a very small oval head, totally black and no obvious clothing. I saw no face, even though it emerged very near a street lamp and so was well illuminated. I was terrified, and to this day, no one believes me. Now, Simon's Stickman resembles similar figures reported throughout the early 2000s. A Hampshire woman also saw one of these beings late one evening while relaxing on a flatbed trailer by a campfire. The witness was looking across the field when a very large humanoid, twice the height of an average human being, jumped down from a tree just under 100 feet away. In the witness's words, it appeared to be made out of sticks. He landed in a crouched position with one hand on the ground in front of him. He seemed to look at me for about 5 seconds, then jumped straight back up into the tree and sort of strode away, and the branches along the line of the fence to the corner of the field, where he turned away from me and went out of sight. I and a friend whom I called over went and examined the place where he jumped down and where he turned and went away. We found nothing but a strong smell of decay. An argument can be made that a minor wave of stickmen swept the globe, as we have several accounts from America during this same time frame. A man passing through Chaffee, Missouri in December of 2003 claimed to look to the side of the road only to see a gangly figure keeping pace with his vehicle, even though he was moving at around 50 miles per hour. The shape was silvery, the color of aluminum, or, if you're from the UK, aluminium, and seemed almost stooped over as it ran alongside his vehicle. Eventually, the figure seemed to fade out of sight until the witness could no longer see it. Just 1 month later, another stickman appeared near Manchester, Indiana. On January 24th, 2004, another driver spotted something crouched beside a puddle of water along the side of North Hogan Road. The witness, who was traveling southbound, said it was around 7:30 p.m. when their headlights illuminated this bipedal figure. Now, when this happened, the figure stood, revealing its uncanny frame, which looked pencil thin and stretched about 7 feet tall. Each joint seemed far too sharp, almost pointed, and buckled as it walked off into the forest. A female witness from Elkader, Iowa, spotted something similar just a short time later. At around 11 p.m. on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2004, something described as weird-looking and pencil-thin stared at the witness for a few moments before abruptly running off. The incident left the witness so disturbed that she wept for 2 full hours afterward. It's worth comparing these descriptions to a Brazilian case from the same time period. On January 31st, 2004, Alan Flavio of João Pessoa, Brazil, saw something tall and slim according to Alan. It had the same texture and color as as graphite, that is to say, a dark gray. And most disturbingly, the figure reappeared to Alan later that night, where it paralyzed him in his bedroom as he slept. Whether this was an actual visitation or a nightmare with sleep paralysis remains anyone's guess. So what are these things? Do you believe the ancient tales of the entities like Baycock and Clutchbone? Could these be aliens? Hopefully, we will find the answers someday. No bones about it. On a wet and stormy night in December of 1952, I found myself at a country station some miles and a half away from my Sussex home. The train from London had arrived late. The bus had gone and no taxis were available. The rain was heavy and incessant. The time was 5:55 p.m. and I was expecting an important trunk call from overseas at 6 p.m. at home. The situation seemed desperate. To make matters worse, the station call box was out of order, and some trouble on the line made access to the railway telephone impossible. In despair, I sat down in the waiting room and, having nothing better to do, I compared my watch with the station clock, allowing for the fact that this is always kept 2 minutes in advance. I was able to confirm the fact that the exact time was 5:57 p.m., 3 minutes to 0 hour. What happened next, I cannot say. When I came to myself, I was standing in my hall at home. A good 20 minutes walk away, the clock was striking 6. My telephone call duly came through a few minutes later. Having finished my call, I awoke to the realization that something very strange had happened. Then, much to my surprise, I found that my shoes were dry and free from mud, and my clothes showed no sign of damp or damage. To modern ears, such stories sound absolutely absurd, but they're a part of a long-standing tradition where such miracles can and often happen. Religions are filled with stories of teleportation, especially in tales surrounding Christian saints. Sometimes they reappear somewhere else or in two places at once, a phenomenon known as bilocation. Bilocation is closely related to the phenomenon of doppelgangers, where exact replicas of a person are seen by others, or, in cases predicting the person's death, by their owners. Going back to the first story, wouldn't it be nice to simply just snap your finger? Oh, crap. Hold on a second, guys. I can fix this. Cool. There we go. I'm back. This does sound like science fiction, but some stories do seem to suggest that there might actually be power in teleportation, wherein people or objects appear instantaneously. I'm not going to snap my fingers again for the sake of me disappearing, and they might reappear somewhere else. This just might be a genuine phenomenon, and I'm going to show you some real-life examples. Take, for example, the Mary Jesus of Agreda. Officially, she never left her convent in Spain. However, there are reputable reports, more than 500 in fact, of her appearing in America between 1620 and 1631, where she had ministered to Humano Indians in what is today called New Mexico. Now, these stories came not only from the indigenous population, but also from missionaries that the church had dispatched to the American Southwest. In fact, in 1622, Father Alonso de Benavides wrote both the Pope and the King of Spain demanding to know why the Humano already knew of Christianity before his arrival. It seems as though Father Alonso might have felt undermined by the arrival of another missionary without his prior knowledge. The Humano told Father Alonso that they had learned about the religion from a European nun they called the Lady in Blue, who actually left them physical artifacts of her presence in the form of a chalice, crosses, and rosaries. The chalice was later examined and believed to have come from Mary Jesus' convent. To make the nun's case even more compelling, Father Alonso was granted permission to examine her and discover that her account conformed exactly to the letter with what he had heard all the way to the other side of the world. She even accurately described their customs and their appearance with startling accuracy. Now, teleportations are not always pleasant affairs. Sometimes they occur involuntarily. Oh crap, I did it again. I need to stop doing that. An argument can be made that ancient accounts of being kidnapped by the fairies or modern stories of alien abduction where victims are found miles from where they started might be categorized in this context. Another tale from Spanish culture, often retold as a ghost story, describes a soldier who, in October of 1593, was found wandering Mexico City's main plaza. He seemed confused, as did everyone else. His uniform looked completely unfamiliar to them. Only after talking to him did they discover that he had started his day in the Philippines. As it turned out, his uniform was an exact match for Spanish soldiers stationed over 9,000 miles away. The soldier explained how he had been on a sentry duty at the governor's palace, located in Manila, before finding himself miraculously transported. It was a tumultuous time, he elaborated, since the governor had recently just been assassinated. All this news to folks in Mexico City. However, when a ship arrived in Mexico months after the soldier's teleportation, the crew confirmed numerous aspects of his story, including the governor's assassination. Now, one of the more famous modern accounts of possible teleportation occurred in 2018, rather recent actually. On February 7th, Konstantinos Danny Flippidis, I believe it said, of Toronto, Canada, mysteriously vanished from a New York resort near Whiteface Mountain. I mean, there was no sign of a major avalanche nor any other explanation for his mysterious disappearance. He had even left behind all of his belongings, including but not limited to his identification and even his vehicle. All combined, the ensuing search party spent nearly 7,000 hours searching for Danny, but he never turned up. Everyone feared the worst, and to their joy and surprise, the Danny placed a phone call to his wife on February 13th, 2018, one day before Valentine's Day. So fellas, if you're out there watching this, just remember, if Danny can remember to call his sweetheart a day before Valentine's Day, well, you don't got any excuses. Somehow, someway, Danny wound up in California, nearly 3,000 miles away. While it's entirely possible to cover this distance in under a week, like a plane will have you there in the same day, Danny was found wearing the same ski gear he wore when he vanished, down to his helmet and goggles. As to how he wound up in California, Danny had no idea, other than that he simply felt dazed and confused. And no, we're not talking about the movie. Danny has no history of mental illness either. The only thing he remembered about his last moments in New York was that he, in his words, went down, and the next thing he knew, he woke up cold and sore. The only thing he can guess is that he flagged down a truck at some point because he vaguely recalls hearing a truck driver mentioning that they were entering Utah. The best explanation that medical officials can offer was that Danny suffered a concussion and entered what's called a fugue state, a poorly understood state of consciousness where victims travel vast distances without the ability to recall or recollect where or why they wandered. Their diagnosis still remains inconclusive, though, in many regards. If Danny did suffer a fugue state, it must represent one of the most dramatic examples. Supposedly, Danny retained one credit card, which he had paid for his expenses during his zombie-like state. That, or he teleported. Now, this is just me personally speaking. Why wouldn't you just look at his purchase history over the last 7 days with that credit card? I mean, wouldn't that kind of prove if he really was transported or not? I don't know. But other examples of teleportation seem to be much more mysterious. In a famous case from Pune, India, a young boy in the early 20th century was actually levitated and transported on more than one occasion. In addition to himself, between 1928 and 1929, researchers recorded hundreds of instances where objects in his direct vicinity moved on their own, including examples where they vanished and reappeared later. It's like we're living in a real-life Unreal Engine 5 here. The Pune case naturally brings us to the topic of teleported objects. We find this phenomenon across a broad spectrum of paranormal interaction, from UFO contact to poltergeist infestations. In fact, one of the hallmarks of poltergeist activity is the sudden disappearance and reappearance of objects referred to in the parapsychological literature as apports or disapports. Teleporting objects might be the most common of all paranormal phenomena. We have all had it happen to us, at least at one point or another. In 1957, for example, researcher Raymond Bayless reported a long-handled paintbrush that simply slipped from his hand, then vanished while speaking with a student in a Los Angeles art studio. There was nothing else in the room except 2 stools and an easel. There wasn't even any carpet, nor was the room dim. It was brightly filled with sunlight to facilitate their painting. Yet, when the paintbrush fell, both Bayless and the student heard it clatter onto the floor, whereupon it simply ceased to exist. Bayless later concluded that it had just vanished into thin air. I mean, we've all had that happen before. In another example from the early 20th century, a nurse always fastidiously placed her keys on her dining room table the moment she returned home. Well, one day, she was summoned back to work within moments of entering the door. To her surprise, the keys were nowhere to be found. Now, she eventually had a full set made to replace them, but only a few days later, she needed a cork from a medicine bottle and went to where she always kept extras in a tin box in the bottom partition of a trunk in her hallway. There, amidst the spare corks, sat her keys, despite her not opening the box in a very long time, and certainly not the day when her keys disappeared. There might be an actual scientific basis for teleportation, though, because in 2017, Chinese scientists announced that they had successfully teleported a particle from the surface of the Earth to a satellite orbiting our very planet. It wasn't much, just a photon, a subatomic particle, but it reappeared on China's Myceus satellite from its starting point in the Gobi Desert over 300 miles below. The actual science behind it is quite confusing, and it's important to note that this did not represent the physical transportation of a photon, but rather the transfer of information from one photon to a second photon in a phenomenon known as quantum teleportation. However, it might as well serve as proof of concept that more sophisticated forms of teleportation, where objects are physically instantaneously transported vast distances, might just be around the corner. A question lingers, however. Is this a scientific breakthrough, or are human beings just now catching up with an older, more dramatic phenomena once known to our mystics, seers, and saints? Could teleportation have been real all along, and we are just now unraveling the mysteries behind one of the fundamental marvels of our own universe? Well, only time will tell. One afternoon, it was clear enough from the tracks that the animals weren't far off. The wind was in my face, which was good for approaching them without them knowing I was there. And all of a sudden, I saw one of the animals quite clearly, and now I must admit, I was really afraid. It had stopped among some young saplings. It was a huge elephant with big white tusks, very curved, and it was a dark chestnut color as far as I could see. It had fairly long hair on the hindquarters, but it seemed shorter on the front. I must say, I had no idea that there were such big elephants. It had huge legs and moved very slowly. I've only ever seen elephants in pictures, but I must say that even from this distance, we were some 300 yards apart. I can never have believed any beast could be so big. Now, this was taken from a Russian hunter in 1918 roaming the Siberian taiga, and claimed that he stumbled upon gigantic oval tracks in the dirt, each about 2 feet across. Now, he tracked the footprints until they led to a huge heap of dung composed of vegetable matter. Limbs in the entire area appeared broken at a height of 10 feet, as if something massive had recently pushed through the forest. But let's fast forward to modern day just real quick. And one of the most recent alleged sightings occurred in 2012.
Some people say it's a hoax, but others claim it could be evidence that woolly mammoths are still alive.
Someone claimed to be an engineer employed by the Russian government who had posted a video online. Now, the footage supposedly recorded the summer before in Siberia's own Chukotka Autonomous Okrug region, and clearly shows a large dark shape wading across a river, complete with a long trunk. Now, immediately, the video was met with accusations of hoaxes and lies, but many people thought that it was simply a bear carrying a fish in its mouth. Some Hollywood experts claimed that the footage looked intentionally blurred. In February of 2012, a videographer stepped forward and claimed that the footage was actually his, though he never remembered seeing a mammoth among the wildlife he captured. Oh, come on, guys. Now, this has led many to suspect that the video is actually a CGI hoax. Even if the Siberian mammoth footage recorded in 2011 was a hoax, the region has no shortage of stories where eyewitnesses claim to have seen the gigantic hairy beasts. Now, the possibility that woolly mammoths still survive in the Siberian wilderness is appealing. I mean, after all, the region is famously inhospitable, with a population density of only 7 people per square mile. It seems entirely possible that a population of these beasts might be able to remain hidden long after their presumed extinction. Suggestions that mammoths still live today can be found in some North American tribal lore as well. The Nescopy of Labrador once spoke of a monster who had used its long nose to strike people in the Northeast. In the Northeast, Algonquin tribes once described what they called a great moose that prepared its nest with a limb or a 5th leg. This, of course, strikingly resembles a trunk, either that or a porn star moose. Are there indeed relict mammoth populations in the coldest, most remote parts of our very world? Perhaps. But another far stranger possibility is that woolly mammoths did indeed die out, but managed to slip into the modern day through rips in time. Yeah, it's a wild idea, but one case suggests that this is precisely what is happening. On September 18th, 2008, Jill O'Brien visited Alaska's Wrangell Elias National Park. An avid photographer, she had just finished setting up what she described as a great shot of Mount St. Elias when she noticed a funny crunching and thudding on the ground. Now, when she turned to look, Jill saw something that left her amazed and startled. It was a small, hairy elephant running toward her, by all appearances, a juvenile woolly mammoth. Now, she said that it stood around 4 feet tall. As it raced in her direction, it offered her a quick glance her way and then vanished into a small black cloud of smoke that sucked into itself and was gone. These are her words. The entire affair lasted no longer than 7 seconds at most, but left a very strong impression on Jill. You don't say. Now, years later, she actually told researcher Nick Redfern it was a mammoth. It was a baby mammoth. It was there 1 second, then it looked at me, and it was gone, like it went invisible or just vanished. While the idea of encountering a woolly mammoth in the wilderness sounds frightening, it would probably leave you alone if you kept your distance. If you stumble upon a saber-toothed cat, you run the risk of becoming its lunch. Now, saber-toothed cats were large predators that went extinct somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. One species, Smilodon, had front fangs about 11 inches long. That's not a tooth. That's a tooth. Saber-toothed cats were once known as saber-toothed tigers, but it was determined that they were not tigers at all. In his 1966 book, The Cloud Forest, author Peter Matheson shared a story told to him in Paraguay by a sailor. Matheson says that the sailor described a rare striped cat not quite so large as a jaguar and very timid, which is possessed of 2 very large protruding teeth. Now, this animal, he said, occurs in the mountain jungles of Colombia and Ecuador, and he has glimpsed it once himself. The story shared by Matheson's informant alludes to the fact that many contemporary saber-toothed cat sightings occur from the southwestern United States all the way through Latin America. Now, for instance, for over 100 years, a story has persisted that somewhere in Arizona, 2 of the predators were shot and killed by U.S. cavalrymen around the year 1913. Now, another sighting allegedly occurred in 1946 in New Mexico. A man by the name of Jerry Padilla. Now, he claimed that a deceased family member had shared their sighting of what seemed to be a saber-toothed cat. Its pelt was the color of a lion's. Another eyewitness claimed in 1975 to have encountered what locals called a mutant jaguar in Paraguay. It was successfully shot and killed and found to weigh 160 pounds. And zoologist Juan Acavar allegedly examined this specimen and described it as having a pair of 2 canine teeth, each measuring a foot long. It wasn't one tooth, it was two. Ha ha. Sorry, dad joke. While Juan suspected this was the find of the century, a Smilodon specimen in the flesh, the body was in the hands of local authorities, who did not wish to upset the residents for some reason, perhaps to avoid panic. Now, they stuck to the mutant jaguar explanation and presumably disposed of the carcass elsewhere. Now, interestingly, Africa has its own tradition of saber-tooth cat sightings. In Chad, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, these are known as tigre de montagne and water lions. Now, in 1970, cryptozoologist Christian Lee Knoll showed a series of living and extinct cats to his indigenous trackers. He had asked each of them to identify which one bore the closest resemblance to the tigre de montagne, and each one quickly selected a picture of the Smilodon. So Christian wrote this: "To convince me, they took me to a rock shelter cave where, according to them, there was a mountain tiger about 30 years ago. My first tracker, J. May, affirmed to have seen it with his father during a hunting party in these hills of Malay. He and his father had managed to kill a horse antelope, and at the time of the skinning, a mountain tiger had emerged from the bush to seize the trophy and had won without apparent effort in front of both terrified and dumbfounded hunters, who returned empty-handed to the village." One of the few saber-tooth cat sightings outside the Americas or Africa is also one of the most recent, because in May of 1994, a witness in China's northwestern Hubei province spotted what appeared to be a massive white cat with vertical stripes on the tallest peak in the Sheninjia region. The animal seemed to be between 13 and 16 feet long. That's ridiculous. While this could conceivably be dismissed as a white tiger, one aspect of the sighting made this cat stand out. It displayed a pair of enormous canine teeth, estimated to be at least 9 inches long. After spotting the massive predator, the witness learned that local hunters had actually killed several of these creatures in the past. Is extinction the end? Well, maybe not. It seems like every year we are always met with new stories of various species presumed long gone from the face of the earth, reappearing in the most unlikely of places. For example, towards the end of last year, scientists even discovered, off the coast of California, a clam specimen that was believed to have died out over 40,000 years ago. Could bigger species like woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats still exist? Now, compared to the clam species, the woolly mammoth vanished a short time ago. Now, the last mammoth presumably died only 3,600 years in the past, but stories where people see these majestic creatures persist into the modern era, calling into question whether they fully ever went extinct or clung to survival in sporadic pockets here and there. While we don't have any stories of saber-toothed cats entering or leaving glitches in time, like Jill's baby mammoth story, we are still left wondering where these animals long believed extinct might come from. Are their populations still out there hiding from human beings? Or, when they visit, are they only here temporarily? Either way, the fact that they are seen from time to time offers a glimmer of hope. Whenever we declare a species vanished from the face of the earth, they might still persevere somewhere, somehow, some way. Although we assume extinction is the end, we are sometimes proven very wrong, to our constant delight. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think, so be sure to let me know what you think down in the comments below. I would love to hear from all of you. And as always, if you guys enjoy this kind of content, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more videos just like this one. And as always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.